you, Andy. Thank you, Helen, for all of the organization of this event. I'll be very brief, but pretty passionate. I'm introducing a group called NewsGuard and a longtime colleague, Gordon Crovitz, who was the publisher of the Wall Street Journal when I was there. And I was there for about 15 years. I think Gordon was there for close to 3 decades, and was publisher when Rupert Murdoch bought the newspaper. And there were a number of things that characterized the Wall Street Journal in what I think was its heyday. One was a very strict editorial separation between the edit page and opinion and the news department, which was an objective and very well-staffed news department. And another was a passion for having a business model that included a digital subscription and people paying for legitimate news and paying to support it. The Wall Street Journal really pioneered the digital subscription, followed by the New York Times and followed by many others. And Gordon and his colleague, Matt Skavinsky, who will present the findings of their company, NewsGuard, which were commissioned by the Lenfest Institute, also had a company called Press Plus. Press Plus was the original and leading provider of pay meters to some 500 publishers around the country. So they were pioneers in user payment and digital subscription marketing, another very, very good cause before NewsGuard. And Gordon can talk about why they founded NewsGuard. But I was delighted yesterday by the resonance on Twitter and across the Spotlight PA, Philadelphia Inquirer network of newspapers, including many represented on this call. And I think we have something very, very important to talk about, not just defining this problem of misinformation and disinformation, but what the heck to do about it. Before introducing Gordon, I'll just recognize Chris Baxter, who is, you can give a wave, who is the editor-in-chief of Spotlight PA, based in Harrisburg, which now has 60 partners, including many of you. Annie Madonia, who is the Chief Advancement Officer at the Lenfest Institute, and Yossi Lichterman, who is our head of thought leadership and editorial, and who helped organize this event. So with that, my dear friend and longtime colleague, Gordon Crovitz.
It often helps if you're not muted. I have unmuted myself. Jim, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. Jim mentioned a startup that Matt and I worked on a few years ago to help support digital subscriptions for news sites. That's when I think we realized the unique role that news publishers in Pennsylvania play. The first news site to license our technology was your colleagues in Lancaster, now called Lancaster Online, I believe. And that led, as Jim said, to hundreds and hundreds of others. And we had a greater density of news sites in Pennsylvania, I think, than anywhere else in the world. So we got to know many of your operations, and we're delighted to be able to speak to you today. And we're grateful to the Lenfest Institute for having the great idea to ask us to do this report. We had never actually looked at the relative amounts of misinformation and engagement with websites that publish misinformation on a state-by-state basis before. That was really Jim's idea, and we were, as you'll see, a bit surprised by some of the results ourselves, but it certainly underscores the mission of NewsGuard, which we started 3 years ago. Steve Brill, the founder of Court TV and American Lawyer, and I, the two co-founders, and Matt Skavinsky's been our general manager from the very start. Our mission was to try to help restore trust to trustworthy journalism while helping consumers understand that there were an awful lot of unreliable sources that they were seeing as they thumbed through their Facebook feed or their Twitter feed, or were looking at YouTube or seeing search results. And we've been pretty shocked actually by the extraordinarily high percentage of news that is consumed by people from sources that are not trustworthy. And Matt will give some of the data there, as well as some of the best practices for news sites to regain or gain or protect the trust that they deserve from readers. Before I hand off to Matt, let me just say a couple of words about how NewsGuard operates practically. We have a team of analysts who have rated and created what we call nutrition labels for all the news and information publishers that account for 95% of engagement in the countries in which we operate. Those are the US, UK, Germany, France, and Italy. And what that means is we've identified 9 basic apolitical criteria of journalistic practice having to do with credibility or transparency. And every one of the sites gets a point score from 0 to 100. And for consumers, a red or green rating and a nutrition label. We then license that data to companies like Microsoft for its New Edge browser, to internet providers, education companies, anybody, health, hospital systems, anybody that wants to help their customers or users have a safer experience on the internet by knowing who's feeding them the news. Is this story coming from a generally trustworthy site or a generally untrustworthy site? So that's a bit of background into NewsGuard. Matt will present the results of this report, and we'll take questions either in the chat area, or we'll save time for questions from the Zoom group after Matt's presentation. Matt.
Thank you, Gordon. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work well. Hopefully everybody can see the cover slide of the presentation. So, as Gordon said, NewsGuard, what we do as a company, generally speaking, is focused on helping consumers understand the difference between credible news sources and misinformation sources and everything in between. And in this report, we really focused on news sources either in Pennsylvania or covering Pennsylvania news in some way. So I'm going to start actually by just providing some of the context around this issue, and kind of, I think this will help set the stage for what we're talking about in this report. And the context is declining trust in news, kind of nationwide, probably globally, but certainly in the United States. There's a lot of data that supports this, data from Pew Research, Reuters, Edelman Trust Barometer, showing that large percentage of respondents to surveys had either experienced some confusion from misinformation, or 9 in 10 had come across some form of what they classified as made up news regularly. A large percentage of the population worries about false news being weaponized and used against people and to manipulate them. And in general, this ranks as a very high concern, among other concerns that people are worried about. So people are aware of the concept of misinformation. The problem is that, for publishers especially, is that, within that, because of that worry, perhaps, trust in news media has fallen substantially in recent years. And to the tune of 69% of Americans say their trust in media has fallen in recent years, and only a much smaller percentage say their trust in media has grown. And that's a concerning trend if you're a news publisher. It's also a concerning trend if you're interested in a democracy that functions, where people have some sense of ground source of truth on which to make decisions. At the same time, for local publishers, there's a bit of a different story. So while national news overall trust in news has fallen, people still, generally speaking, trust local news sources, especially their local newspapers. This data basically says 85% of people have at least some trust in local news, compared to just 62% for national news. And in fact, 38% of people said they had very little or no trust in national news, compared to just 15% for local news. So there's a big difference there. Now, that trust is good for local publishers in the sense that I think it's one of the greatest assets you can have as a publisher, is that your readership trusts you. But it's also an opportunity for actors of partisan actors and others who are looking for some remaining resource to exploit. And what I mean by that is, because people trust local news, we're seeing this trend nationally of bad actors, or at least actors with conflicted interests, kind of latching on to the trust that people have in local news and exploiting it, and at the same at the same time undermining that trust. So that can be sites that are just churning out mostly plagiarized content for ad fraud purposes. There's been several well-publicized networks like that. That can mean sites that kind of mimic some form of, they name themselves and look like a local news site, and they really just do that to publish one sensational hoax story and try to make it go viral on Facebook. And it can mean local news sites that are partisan funded, that come from partisan groups. We'll talk a lot more about that in a minute. So in this report, we really focused on three key questions. The first was, what is the current state of media credibility when we look at publications either that are local news publications in Pennsylvania, or publications that are covering news about Pennsylvania. Second question we looked at is, what are some threats to trust in local news in Pennsylvania? And we also looked at, what are some things that Pennsylvania publishers, and really any publisher, can do to try to improve trust among readers, viewers, and listeners. And I will say, right up front, that we have some concrete suggestions in this presentation of what publishers can do to enhance transparency and credibility practices that will build some trust with readers. But there's no silver bullet to this problem. There's probably a lot of things that need to change to really preserve trust in news. I'll talk about what some of those are later in the presentation. But before I get into the findings, I want to spend, if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I want to sort of answer the question that may be on many people's minds, which is, who are you to tell us which news publications are trustworthy and not trustworthy? What do you mean you assess the credibility of news sources? What does that actually mean? So just a few minutes to give you some background on NewsGuard and how we do our work. And this is the same methodology we used for the report. So first, what is NewsGuard? We use journalism to fight online misinformation and disinformation, and to improve news literacy among consumers. So we have a team of journalists who provide credible and independent trust ratings. We've rated over 6,000 news and information websites that account for actually 95, this says 90%, it's a little outdated, 95% of online engagement across the US, UK, France, Germany, and Italy. And everything we do is designed to be transparent and accountable. Sort of, the term we use is, we're sort of the opposite of an algorithm. Algorithms that choose which news to surface are opaque. You have no idea how they're making decisions. NewsGuard is, we try to be totally transparent and tell readers and users everything about how we made our decisions and why. So what we actually do, we produce what we call nutrition labels for news. We rate each outlet on 9 apolitical basic journalistic criteria. Based on those criteria, they get an overall rating. So red means the site is generally untrustworthy. It does not adhere to basic journalistic practices, and green means that it's generally trustworthy. Not all green rated sites are perfect. Not all red rated sites are making everything that they publish up. There are degrees of that. And that's why we also provide a score of 0 to 100 points, completely driven by those 9 criteria, that gives you a sense of kind of where on the spectrum does this site fall. So you
And
have to get a
Matt,
score of 60 or above to get a green rating.
Andy Conti had a quick question in the chat. The business model is you license, you're an information service company, so you license
Yes.
these data and information to advertisers and to ISPs and telecom companies and so forth, right?
Exactly. So yeah, we basically maintain this data set about news credibility, and we license it to anyone who, companies that interact with news. So that could be platforms like search engines or social media platforms. It could be advertisers who want to target ads on trustworthy news sites or avoid placing ads on misinformation sites. And it could also be news aggregators that want to select news from trustworthy sources. So we provide our data, and then businesses decide what decisions they'll make based on that. But that's the only thing we sell is our ratings. And of course, we don't charge publishers anything for that, for being rated. And the last thing I'll say about our process is that the result of all of this, we've got overall rating for the site, we've got a nutrition label, or sorry, a point score of 0 to 100. And the last thing we produce is what we call a nutrition label, which is this detailed explanation of why we gave the rating, each of the 9 criteria, and what the site is about. As I mentioned, so again, red rating, I'll use that term in this presentation, so just wanted to clarify, red rating means the site generally fails to meet basic standards of credibility and transparency. Green rating means the site generally adheres to those standards. You can see some examples like, you don't have to be perfect. Maybe you're a local newspaper that doesn't have clear disclosure of your ownership. You'll lose a few points for that, but you'll still get a green rating. On the other hand, if you egregiously distort facts or publish false news, you'll get a red rating. And here are the 9 criteria we use. You'll see 5 of them are about credibility. These are weighted based on importance. So not, publishing false content repeatedly hurts your rating a lot more than, not having clear bylines on articles, for example. But these criteria are really apolitical. You'll see there's no, left or right way to have, a disclosure of your ownership. You either do or you don't. And our process is quite rigorous. So it involves, a journalist, a trained analyst journalist who reviews the site. We always contact the site for comment if we think they've failed even one of the 9 criteria that we rate against. So we give them a chance to make any corrections to that, to tell us if we got something wrong. And we have quite a few publishers who have improved their practices because of us. And then we have multiple layers of fact checking and editing before the rating is published. And even once it's published, we periodically update and check all of our ratings to make sure that they're still accurate. Here's what, when I mentioned a nutrition label, here's what that looks like at the end of the day. So it's, the 9 criteria are listed and the site's performance on each criteria is spelled out. We describe, ownership and financing of the site. We describe the content of the site. We delve into the credibility and explain why we've asserted that the site fails any of the 9 criteria. We include the publisher's comments if they've given us any comments, and we talk about their transparency practices and history. And all of this is designed so that a reader can see who worked on this rating, who edited it, who fact checked it, and they can share us feedback in case we got something wrong. And they can actually see all of the sources we used as well in a sources section at the bottom of the page. I'm almost done with the Why Trust NewsGuard section, so bear with me. Who's behind NewsGuard? You met Gordon. Our other co-founder is Steve Brill, who is award-winning journalist and founded Court TV, The American Lawyer, and other journalistic endeavors. We have a wide range of advisors with experience in everything from editorial content to national security and state-sponsored disinformation and the like. And our team itself is led by former editors from Reuters and the Associated Press, as well as the Chicago Tribune. And we have analysts from a range of different publications, all with, known for being credible, legitimate news outlets. One question on your mind might be, does rating news actually work? We did some research on that in partnership with Gallup, funded by the Knight Foundation, and found, generally speaking, users found our nutrition labels quite useful. and that users were less likely to share news if they saw that it came from a red rated site, meaning that we found the site not to be credible. And the result of all of this, as I said, we've one kind of side effect of us contacting these sites for comments has been that quite a large number of publishers will actually improve something about their credibility or transparency in order to better adhere to our standards. And we see that as kind of a, net positive change of our rating process, that publishers, will opt to be more transparent with readers and take steps that can build trust. So that's NewsGuard in a nutshell, and that's the context that I think you need to understand kind of our thinking on and our process and how we arrived at some of the key findings in this next section. So, we looked at, to start, we looked at just publications that are, local Pennsylvania news sites. So this is not including national sources that covered Pennsylvania in this part of the report. We just looked at, local news in Pennsylvania. And we found, hopefully unsurprisingly to most of the folks on this call, that most Pennsylvania local news outlets are highly credible. The average trust score based on our 9 criteria was 93.4. A site only needs to get a 60 to get a green overall rating from NewsGuard, so that's quite good. We found that 70% of all the publishers we looked at fell into that generally credible bucket, and the remaining 30% I'll talk about. Primarily they were partisan funded sites masquerading as local news. But this suggests that if you're a reader of a real local news outlet in Pennsylvania, you don't have to worry very much that the news you're getting will be trustworthy. So a lot of this report is about how to make readers aware that the news is trustworthy and believe that it's trustworthy, but the trustworthiness itself is proven out by our rating process. We did find a few specific criteria where the numbers were worse, than typical. So, a substantial number of publishers didn't have consistently enforced policies for publishing corrections when they make a reporting error. This is a practice that was quite universal in print and is and when we look at this nationally and in Pennsylvania, is less consistent among digital publishers. We found, plenty of issues where publishers probably, in many cases, just because they hadn't thought of it, weren't clearly disclosing ownership and financing details to readers. And you'll see in the next section why that's so important. And we saw that, there were also plenty of publishers who weren't disclosing, things about who's in charge of content decisions or who is actually producing content, including naming any potential conflicts of interest. And again, you'll see when I give some examples of the sites that had overall red ratings from us, why those are some important things for a publisher that is trustworthy to do. We also looked at coverage about Pennsylvania news, whether it was from a local Pennsylvania news publisher or not. So this includes national sources that wrote about Pennsylvania. Both of these, by the way, are based on a year of data from March 2020 through March 2021. So, again, we found that of the publishers that were in the top 1,000 sites with the most engagement for their Pennsylvania related coverage, 85% of them were generally credible, which is great. But we also found that the 13.5% that were not credible within that group accounted for about 25% of all the engagement with Pennsylvania related news on social media. So what that means is, essentially these unreliable sites are more successful, relatively speaking, than their trustworthy counterparts at getting people to engage with content on social media. And that's a trend that exists not just in Pennsylvania, but nationally, that unfortunately misinformation and sensational information tends to get a lot of engagement on social media, in part because of the way algorithms that newsfeed algorithms work, and in part because of it's easier to make a really interesting story if you're not worried about it being true. That's a one fact to consider. The other finding, so those were some of the, but that was mostly good news. I think the other thing that we found that we talk a lot about in the report, and I'll go into here in just a second, is that just like we've seen in other parts of the country and nationwide, there are partisan funded local quote unquote news sources that are designed to look and feel like they are local newspapers or local news outlets all across Pennsylvania, really cutting across different geographies and regions of the state. And these, because readers disproportionately trust local news, these really do pose a threat to legitimate local news, in the sense that the more readers encounter this kind of source and see what will look like a local newspaper providing highly skewed content or content that turns out later not to be true, it's going to be harder and harder for legitimate local publishers to preserve the trust that they've built with readers and earned from readers, based on their great reporting and all the steps that they take to avoid bias and conflicts of interest and the like.
And if I can just interrupt here just for a moment, because I find this maybe the most troubling trend that we have identified across the country. These are websites created by political partisans without disclosing their ownership and control, after having raised funds on the basis that they were going to create what looked like independent local news sites in order to favor one political party or the other. As you can see here, they take names like Crawford Times and Bucks County News and Keystone Today. They'll look to a reader as if they could be a 200-year-old newspaper. And they've done that intentionally, trading off, I would put it, all of the work that legitimate journalists have done for hundreds of years to establish brand credibility and credibility in the news. And this has the very real risk of reducing trust generally in local news. If people start coming across news, they see that it's highly partisan. If they're not news junkies who are sophisticated about these things, can very easily begin to think that all news is like this, secretly partisan. So this is a very troubling and very large dynamic in Pennsylvania and in almost every state across the country. And it's both sides. It's secretly funded right-wing sites and secretly funded left-wing sites, as Matt will describe.
That's exactly right, Gordon. So just to make this a little more concrete for everyone. So, if you're in the Lehigh Valley, you might come across two websites. One is called Lehigh Times, the other is called Lehigh Valley Live. And they both have news stories. Some of them are local looking, some of them are national looking. They both have the same kind of basic layout. Easily a reader could look at this and say this is a local news site for both sites. So let's say it's a really discerning reader and they take the time to go and click on the About Us page for these two sites. So on Lehigh Times, they'll see this blurb. It says it's funded by a nonprofit. It says it is our approach is to provide objective, data-driven information without political bias. And the other one, actually, the About Us page leads to a page for advertisers about marketing and telling your story. So, of the two, as a reader right now, I'm kind of leaning toward the Lehigh Times. It talks about, on its About Us page, it talks a little bit more about the journalistic process and, avoiding bias and all of that. But actually, if once you dig a bit more beneath the surface, you'll see, Lehigh Times is part of this organization called Metric Media that has, I think, about 1,300 websites nationally, all with names and layouts like this. And Metric Media is run by a conservative political consultant, has been found to publish, according to a New York Times report on this, coverage that is, quote, coverage that is ordered up by Republican groups and corporate PR firms. Meanwhile, Lehigh Valley Live is the website of the Express Times newspaper that has been covering local news since 1855, and that gets a 100-point trust score from NewsGuard. These are very different sites, but to an average reader, certainly to one who is not that discerning, and even for one that takes a minute to look at what are these two sites, they'd be a bit hard to tell apart. So a little bit more about Metric Media. As I said, they operate 1,300 local news sites, quote unquote local news sites nationwide. We found 45 of those in Pennsylvania. Metric Media honestly accounted for a pretty high percentage of that 30% of sites that were local in Pennsylvania that we found were generally not trustworthy. There were a few others, but they accounted for a big chunk of that. The New York Times has reported that, quote, behind the scenes, many of the stories are directed by political groups and PR firms to promote a Republican candidate or company or to smear their rivals. When you look at the coverage, half of the coverage is written by algorithms, and it just reports out, a canned story based on some jobs data that gets released or something like that. This gives the sites the veneer of credibility, but especially around elections and the like, you'll see a lot of, or particular issues like COVID, you'll see content promoting a specific agenda related to, someone who's, a Metric Media is representing their interests. And just one example of that, across all of, large cross section of their sites, we saw content opposing restrictions on the COVID-related restrictions on the hotel industry. And at the same time, the CEO of Metric Media was, according to a website for his consulting business, was being retained by US-based hotel owners to assist their recovery as a result of the COVID pandemic. So these were stories representing the interests of an industry that the CEO of the company was lobbying for, and no disclosure of that. And that's just one example of many of problematic conflict of interests that we found on these sites. It's not just the Lehigh Times. As I said, there are 45 of these that we found across Pennsylvania. Here's another example, Philly Leader. Again, looks like a fairly normal newspaper. One is phillyleader.com, one is phillytrib.com. Of course, Philly Trib is the oldest continually published African-American newspaper in the United States, telling storied history of coverage of the civil rights movement and, kind of being the voice of a community. And Philly Leader is part of Metric Media that has, again, all of those problems. This is not limited just to the left. So here's another example. Sorry, just to the right, just a conservative leaning publication. So here's another example. I know you all will be familiar with Spotlight PA, but pretend you weren't for a minute. So here you've got two, statewide focused publications. One is called The Keystone, the other is called Spotlight PA. If you're a reader, maybe you haven't heard of them. So you go and look for more information. On both of their about pages, they say something about holding the powerful to account and exposing misinformation and relying on facts and investigative journalism. They both reference being owned by a nonprofit organization. In one case, something called ACRONYM, and the other, a organization you may have heard of called the Lenfest Institute. And they both say that they're operated independently and have editorial independence on their sites, on their about pages. So the problem, Keystone, KeystoneNewsroom.com, is owned by the partisan Democratic advocacy group ACRONYM. ACRONYM has a political action committee called PACRONYM, and its goal is to, its work is about, quote, having helped elect progressive candidates across the country by running dozens of targeted media campaigns to, inspire, register, mobilize voters. So the point is that, ACRONYM is not a company that was built to produce quality journalism. It's a company that was built to elect progressive Democrats to office, and it's a political group. And while there is, there's one reference on the Keystone site about Courier Newsroom, the company within ACRONYM that owns the Keystone, being a progressive media organization. There's nothing about the fact that it's, affiliated with a PAC or that it has an explicit mission to elect Democrats and specific types of Democrats. Now, there's, as I said at the beginning, we always call sites for comment. So, we of course contacted ACRONYM and Courier Newsroom, despite what, they insist sort of there's full editorial independence here. And, whether or not that's true, what we do know is that the CEO of ACRONYM and the CEO of Courier Newsroom are the same person. We know that there was a business plan produced that showed ACRONYM, it's the related political action committee, and Courier Newsroom as being deeply intertwined, and that the Courier sites would produce, quote, content designed to drive strategic narratives to key audiences. And we know that, leading up to the election, Courier Newsroom spent $1.2 million on targeted Facebook ads, promoting content from the site, mostly critical of Trump, to Pennsylvania voters. And we know that on the ACRONYM website, there's a case study about, quote unquote, softening the ground for a Biden-Harris victory by paying to promote news articles to low information audiences, which was effective at increasing Trump disapproval. So, this is another case of it's not the exact same tactic as Metric Media, because Metric has a large number of sites that are really closely resemble local newspapers. This is a statewide source, but it's got a lot more paid media behind it. But in both cases, we've got, at the very least, we've got content that readers ought to know that there is an organization with a specific agenda behind it, and that it is more than just being, something that was designed to produce news. And so there's a big difference we see between the Keystone or any of the Metric Media sites and a site that is a kind of standard local newspaper.
Matt, before we move on to the next section, there are a couple of good questions here that we should, I think, touch on. One is a question about what does it mean that Metric Media produces content created by algorithms?
Sure.
You mentioned that.
If you go to any of the Metric sites, you'll see, if you go into there's sometimes sections about the economy or about politics, and the articles will say things like 2,718 jobs lost in XYZ county this quarter. And the same exact story is on every single Metric Media site with the number swapped out for whatever the jobs data that got released for that county is. There's nothing wrong with that, with that kind of algorithmically produced content. If the data is accurate, they'll also say things like X number of new COVID cases in this county this month. Or when we looked at, very recently, there was a story on, I think, each of the 50 states on all of the sites for their respective governors saying what grade they got from the conservative Cato Institute for their fiscal management, for example. So these are taking data sources, writing a standard story, and filling in the blanks for each state. So that's what we mean by algorithmically produced.
Yeah, and that wouldn't actually probably affect the credibility rating. Matt's point was that they include those kinds of data. By having included those kinds of data-based stories, it does make it look like a data-rich, credible publisher. Exactly. One other question I'll answer briefly. Rosemary asked, how does NewsGuard determine the credibility of news from traditional electronic media, or were they part of the overall report that found local news credible? NewsGuard rates at the domain level or the website level. So all broadcasters have websites also when we rate their website. So they're treated just the same as a legacy newspaper or a new digital only site. Their websites are rated and are included in this report.
Yeah, and to the extent that there are broadcast outlets that have different content on the radio or on the television than what they have on the website, we're rating the content on the website, which often the aired content is on the website anyway, but if it's not, then we're really focusing our rating on what's available online. I see one more question about the Associated Press and whether there's any, why does the AP provide content to sites that would get a red rating from NewsGuard? I can't speak for the AP, but I don't think there's a specific, that I know of, a specific standard that you have to meet in order to license AP content. So it's, as long as it's attributed to the AP, I would imagine it'd be available no matter what kind of site chooses to publish it.
And Matt, maybe one more question. This from Jessica, it's a question with relation to the data point about the relatively small number of unreliable sources having a disproportionate amount of engagement online. And she says, I'm curious if the larger engagement from unreliable sites on social media is due to the fact that more credible news sources have opt-in methods like paid subscriptions, whereas the others can simply create a social media presence and target readers without them even realizing they're being targeted, which I think is a quite good observation. And just to answer that question, absolutely. And this is one of the dynamics of having Facebook and other social media platforms be such an enormous source of news for people. Many of these news publishers are really built around Facebook. Some are built around YouTube through video, and their publishing approach really is to publish outrageous stories, get social media engagement, have it shared, often, amazingly, have the Facebook algorithm recommendation engine say, if you like this kind of misinformation story, you'll like this kind of misinformation story. If you're in a Facebook group that thinks that masks are dangerous, Facebook will ask, do you also want to join a group that says vaccines are dangerous? So the Facebook platform particularly encourages misinformation in ways that never happened in the old world. One of the analogies we give to explain this dynamic, by the way, is for those of you old enough to remember the print era, the analog era, people would go to a newsstand and they would say, I'd like the Philadelphia Inquirer. I don't really want National Enquirer. I want the Philadelphia newspaper. I don't want the grocery store gossip and alien sighting newspaper. And people knew the difference. People in Philadelphia knew the difference between the Philadelphia Inquirer and National Enquirer. And the problem now is, as people get more and more of their news on Facebook, YouTube, etc., it's become very difficult to tell the difference between reliable sources and unreliable sources. So thank you for that question.
And Gordon, as a fairly active Facebooker, tweeter, and Google searcher and tools user, I have never seen one of your ratings on any of those sites. So the platforms not only encourage by their algorithms the spread of dodgy content, they have chosen not to discourage it, at least.
That's right. The only digital platform company that provides our ratings to its users so far is Microsoft.
And why is this? Did they not want to slow down the user experience? Did they not want to sit in judgment of free speech? Do they not want to cede control to a third-party rating system?
Those are wonderful questions to ask Facebook. What happens in practice, of course, is that they will occasionally remove a site, or they will demote a site using unpredictable and often secretive algorithms. But they do it on a basis that's very hard to follow, and they don't disclose their criteria. And frankly, and we'll let Matt go back to his presentation just one second, one of so something I think is not maybe fully appreciated is they have terrible news judgment. So YouTube, for example, when RT, which is Vladimir Putin's Russia Today propaganda operation, when RT became the first news site on YouTube to get 1 billion views, a senior executive from Google went on RT to congratulate them and to describe them as, having succeeded so well because they were authentic and not propaganda. That's the same RT that is required by the Department of Justice to register as a foreign agent. So I think it's asking too much of the digital platforms for them to have journalistic news judgment. That's not what they do. They don't have that expertise. And that's why we think that they ought to make it easier for their consumers to get access to tools like ours and others, middleware tools that give consumers some choice about what they're seeing. And one choice could be, I'd like to know more about who's feeding me the news on Facebook or on YouTube.
Thank you.
So the next part of the presentation is about, what can publishers do to build trust, to retain trust, and to just generally address this problem that is affecting, kind of exists across the whole news landscape. So, in our view, the best solution to, bad actors that are manipulating news and using misinformation to manipulate people is news and media literacy. And discerning readers want information about certain things, about a source, and even readers that aren't actively looking for it appreciate when they have information about a source that tells them who's behind it, like, are they a real person? Can I contact them? Why should I trust them? Do they have any agenda? What's their reputation like? How are they funded? And are they biased? All these questions about sort of what is this source and why should I trust it? Now, publishers alone can't provide that to readers. Some of that requires readers, news consumers developing news literacy schools. A big part of what we do at NewsGuard is advocate for news literacy in schools. We partner with public libraries to help them build news literacy skills among their patrons who use computers at library branches. But there are things that publishers can do to help and to at least make it easier for readers who are kind of starting to think about news literacy to know whether they should trust that publisher's site. And to some extent, these things also distinguish a publisher's site from what you would find on many of the sources that I gave examples of earlier, where something is hidden or not disclosed, and if you were really to scratch through beneath the surface, you would find it. So part of the goal is that when readers are on credible news sites, they should see indicators of all of this kind of information about the source. And when they don't see it on a misinformation site, they might start to question that. So, just for example, we basically take our criteria when publishers ask, what can I do to build trust, and sometimes they ask, what can I do to improve my score from NewsGuard, for that matter. And we basically turn our criteria around and turn them into a checklist. So disclose ownership and financing really clearly to readers, disclose potential conflicts of interest, make it really clear what your policy is for correcting errors that you make it easy for readers to find errors you've made and see you owning up to them and correcting them. If you have a point of view or overall agenda, or even something that might cause the appearance of that, disclose that really clearly to readers. Really clearly label opinionated pieces to distinguish them from news stories, providing information about who's producing content. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Making clear who's in charge of content, how to reach them, their background, anything that readers might want to know that would answer the question of, can I trust this person? And of course, avoiding both misleading content and avoiding the temptation to write sensational clickbaity headlines that will definitely drive up your page views, but drive down readers' trust in your your content. So just an example of, disclosing ownership, of disclosing ownership, we find a lot of sites that have no indication of who owns them anywhere on the site. And even if people do find some indication, it's like a copyright thing at the bottom of the page. And that seems like a missed opportunity, especially in a universe where there are many local sites that are, as we know, are not credible, that are owned by someone with a conflict of interest. And if readers don't see ownership disclosure that's really clear on a trustworthy site, and they don't see clear ownership disclosure on a misinformation site, there's no way for them to tell that one is more credible than the other, at least on this metric. So here's just an example of how Gannett sites disclose their ownership, but you can find these on many sites, and we have a lot of examples of kind of best practice disclosures. It's important that readers not just see the name of the company that owns, but also a little bit about what they are, who they are, talking about what sort of company they are. The same is true for content creators. Here's a really great example of, if I want to know who wrote this story. When you look at data about, for example, especially younger people, what information sources do they trust? And you see a lot of young people today really trust, YouTube influencers or even TikTok influencers. A large part of that is because they know to some degree, at some personal level, they kind of know who the person is who's talking to them, including any baggage that person may have or any points of view that person might have. So here's a really great example of a very detailed author page, where it's easy to contact the author. You can see a description of exactly what reporting they do, their background, where they're from, and even can see which content they've produced. And the more that this kind of disclosure can exist, the more readers are likely to expect it. And it's a lot harder for the metric medias of the world to provide this kind of disclosure of who's producing content. That can go for at the kind of highest levels of who's in charge of content as well. Here's an example of a site in Florida where the person who launched the site ran for Congress as a Republican and lost, but made this news site after that, and has some other explicitly conservative opinion sites that they operate. And so they just disclose that and say, yeah, I ran for Congress, I'm a Republican, this is who I am and what I do. And sort of counterintuitively, being that upfront about any potential conflicts or points of view is likely to give readers more trust in the outlet as opposed to less, because they see that you're not hiding anything. Here's an example of a really great kind of staff-wide Meet Our Team page, the equivalent of a masthead in print. And not every, plenty of sites have some version of this, but the reason I call out this one is just that the kind of depth of how much you can see about the team and how much you can tell that they're real people and see their bona fides, including people on the business side. But this is really useful, again, and just readers who want to know who's behind this site can get a really clear answer to that question, and maybe more information than they'd even want, but enough to tell them that the publisher is being transparent with them.
Is there a statute of limitations for how young your picture can be? Like Chris Baxter looks like he's about 12 there, and I'm just wondering if that's.
We don't assess that as one of our 9 criteria, but I will suggest it at our next staff meeting to look at how recent the photos are as one of the 9.
Just saying. There was a question from John Kay about, after 50 years in journalism, just the observation that there's more and more and more opinion in news coverage, and that is so what you're looking at now. And I didn't mean to break up your flow, but in this flow of what news organizations can do, how to distinguish between opinion and straight news when straight news is increasingly about the voice of the reporter and their perspective.
So,
So just to answer that, it's a very important question. And we think one of the most important ones. All the data say that when people see opinionated writing in what is labeled as news stories, that is one of the surest ways to reduce trust. Even if you agree with it, you don't trust it as news as much as you otherwise would. To us, as you see with all of these, disclosure is really important. So if you disclose that have a particular point of view in your coverage and you don't present your coverage as straight news, that's perfectly fine. You're being straight with readers. They understand what they're getting. What's not fine is to have, a mission statement that talks about, operating without fear or favor, and yet having opinionated language in what's labeled as news coverage. And there's certainly a lot of that around, much more than there used to be.
Thanks, Gordon.
On that point, there's a model that exists more in other countries really than in the US, though increasingly here as well, where, there are news outlets that are designed to be apolitical and kind of as objective as possible. And there are outlets that are really overtly advocating for or being the voice of a particular party or group. And as Gordon said, our view is that what matters most is that readers know what they're getting. So, this is in the UK, and the Mirror on its about page literally says we sit left of center. We've backed the Labour Party in every election since 1945. And that kind of disclosure, like you could imagine some of the sites that we showed earlier, including the Courier newsroom sites, if they said, we're funded, our purpose is to share progressive news and to help elect progressive Democratic candidates, and that was clear to all of their readers, you could imagine that site being a lot less problematic. The problem is when readers look at a site and it seems to be, local news without an agenda, but actually has an axe to grind of some kind. One other, I mentioned corrections policies earlier, and this is, I only mention this because obviously it's not a new concept that news sources should correct errors when they make them, but we find that there are a lot of newspapers that have been publishing for decades or hundreds of years that have always had corrections policies in print, but their digital versions don't contain those, or don't always contain those, or they have a different policy. And we see this as one of the stronger indicators when we look at the correlation between adhering to one of our criteria and getting an overall trustworthy rating. That this is one of the best indicators of a site that is trying to do real journalism, is that they will publicly and clearly correct errors when they make them and make it easy for readers to see that. So, one way to do that is to have both corrections on articles at the top of articles as an editor's note, and also to have an explicit page on a news site that says, here are all the errors we've made, and here's how we corrected them. And it gives readers a sense that you have nothing at all to hide, including being willing to own up to a mistake that you make. And lastly, a lot of readers aren't going to read your code of ethics or whatever policies you put on your website, but it really helps a lot when readers are curious, that they see that there is that kind of code, and that they can see that there's been a lot of thought and rigor put into a policy for correcting errors, a conflict of interest policy, some detail about how you do your reporting that tells them, here's the promise we're making to you as a reader. And we don't see these kinds of detailed ethics policies on many average local sources. We see them mostly on kind of nonprofit sources. This is from ProPublica, and you'll see similar things in a lot of other nonprofit newsrooms. But our view is most newsrooms have something like this. Why shouldn't readers be able to see it? Why wouldn't you want to let readers know that you're putting all of this rigor behind the way you do your work? Last section of this, and I know we're a bit over time, but because we'd hope to have about 30 minutes for kind of a conversation beyond the presentation, but I'll go through these slides quite quickly, I think. So NewsGuard has a few resources for publishers who are interested. One is, I mentioned our ratings, and that part of what we do is about news literacy. We do have a browser extension that's designed to show readers our trust ratings next to news sources. So you can see those green and red icons in a Google search. The green icon indicates a green rating. The red icon indicates a red rating. Our browser extension displays those next to links on Google, Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, kind of everywhere you'd see news aggregated in this way in a feed. And it does that automatically when it's installed, and a user can actually hover over that icon, put their mouse over that icon and see the more detailed description and nutrition label for the site, which you'll see here, and they can actually click through and see the full detailed write-up. For journalists who are in Pennsylvania who are looking to be able to cover the issues around fake news and misinformation, who are looking to cover issues related to media credibility, or just to make sure that if you encounter some of these misinformation or partisan sites that you recognize them, we're making free vouchers available to journalists. So there's an email address here. Feel free to pass that around to any newsrooms of folks that are on the call. You can just contact us at that, and we'll give you a voucher for whichever reporters you ask us to give a voucher for in your organization. We also have assets for publishers that have a green rating from NewsGuard to promote that. So we have image assets, examples of house ads you can run, suggested language for social media posts promoting trust. And we see part of what we're doing, it's obviously our business is focused on providing information to platforms and search engines and others, but one of the benefits of what we're doing is that our ratings can be used by publishers to help promote their credibility. So we have kind of assets that help do that if publishers are interested. These are, of course, completely free and optional. Publishers only use them if they want to. We have language for an About Us page, which again, there's a packet for this. So if anyone is interested, you can contact us at that email address that I mentioned, where a publisher can actually kind of put their rating on their own website. We've had publishers promote their rating on a page on their site. Here's the Independent in the UK, touting its perfect trust rating from us. Here are some more local sources promoting their NewsGuard ratings using some of our assets. There's the Daily Signal touting its green rating from us. They're an example of a site with a partisan leaning that really clearly discloses it. We also have assets for social media. We've had publishers who have promoted the fact that they got a green rating from NewsGuard as a way to let their readers know that they're adhering strongly to trustworthy practices, and that some third party has certified that for them. There's the Center for Public Integrity, which I wouldn't have thought needed to tout their credibility, but I'm glad that they did. We have house ads that you can download and use that promote your green rating to NewsGuard, to your green NewsGuard rating to readers. And those are free. There's a downloadable file for them for anybody who wants it. Here's an example of what those can look like on a house ad. And we've even had publishers touting their NewsGuard rating on their subscription page. It's another publication, The Economist, that we wouldn't have thought needed to let readers know that it's trustworthy because they've been around for over 100 years. But we see trust as a good component of your value to advertise to readers and to market to readers. So again, you're welcome to use your NewsGuard rating to do so. And with that, just wanted to thank everybody for the great questions so far. And we're happy to spend the remainder of the time kind of having a conversation about this, answering further questions and the like.
So Matt and Gordon, thanks for that. It was a fantastic presentation and eye-opening, disturbing, and it was great. It raised a lot of questions. You can see the chat's filled with it. We're actually we're going to turn it over to some of those folks who posted their questions in the chat and just have them address them. Louis, do you want to just voice your questions?
Yeah, sure. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I posted 4 hopefully very quick questions. I don't know if you want me to go through all 4 of them or pause after each one.
How about if you pause after each one and we'll see how succinct we can be.
And maybe Matt could take down the screen. We can see each other better. Yeah, thanks.
Great.
So the first one here is, how do you keep up with the flood of news sites that pop up constantly? And is there a default rating for sources that you haven't evaluated?
Yeah, our leading source of data about new sites that we need to rate is a company called NewsWhip. Some of you may be familiar with it. They're based in Ireland. Their business model, they're partly owned by the AP. Their business model is to help news publishers do better on social media. We use them for a different purpose, which is they're able to track any news story that looks like it's trending on social media or elsewhere on the internet. And if that story is from a website we have not yet rated, we have a real-time team that rates that site very quickly. It's almost always, at this point, a new member of a network of sites, like the ones Matt talked to you about, or a new disinformation site from Russia or China or Iran or something like that. So that's a very important question, and we try to rate those sites within hours so that their stories will come with red warnings if that's what they deserve.
Excellent, thank you. The second one here is, do you look at individual stories that may be inaccurate even though the publishing source is generally considered trustworthy?
One of our criteria is, does this website routinely publish false content? So, we're monitoring that question. We cite the work of fact checkers, but every site, even, the most careful journalistic enterprise makes mistakes. And that's why we say, does this website regularly publish false content? And there are going to be some stories that turn out not to be true that publishers wish they hadn't published. And, if that's not a regular occurrence, they're not going to be dinged on this particular criteria of ours.
Makes sense. The third one here, how do you handle individual sources on social media sites such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter?
Right. So if there are news publishers that have YouTube channels or social media feeds, then those will come with our rating as you see them in your Facebook feed or wherever you're accessing it. Or if you're an individual posting on social media and you link to a news source, as very often happens, especially, by the way, with misinformation and hoaxes, people want to point to what looks like an authority for that claim. That too will come with our red or green rating.
Okay, that's excellent. And then the last one here is, do you have anyone specializing in Chinese news sources, either domestically and or internationally?
Yeah, the China, Russia, and Iran are the 3 leaders in government-funded disinformation. We've rated quite a number of sites that they publish. I wouldn't say we have specialists in them, but we do have people who understand the nature of the disclosures. They almost always don't disclose who actually owns and operates them. But we have rated quite a few of them. And of course, we have to differentiate between an RT or China Times versus the BBC or the Australian ABC or the Canadian CBC. It makes a world of difference if an independent government-funded broadcaster or site has an independent charter, operates in a country where that independent charter is enforceable, et cetera, as opposed to a site being a source of disinformation and funded for that purpose. Some of our most interesting nutrition labels, I think, are from foreign government disinformation sites.
You're assessing their native language site, not their English version.
We're doing whatever site is popular in the 5 countries in which we operate so far. So the US, UK, Germany, France, and Italy. In the case of RT, for example, they have an English language version targeting the US and the UK. They have a German language version for Germany, a French language version for France. We rate each of those separately in the native language, and we have staff who are from those countries and operate in those languages.
Okay, let's turn to Rebecca Ross. Rebecca, you want to voice your question? And maybe Rebecca's not here any longer. I'll ask her question. Do you think businesses will use NewsGuard as a resource to combat disinformation about their organization? It sort of gets to what you were saying.
Yeah, so we certainly, as Matt's latter slides showed, we always welcome publishers helping to reinforce their credibility with their readers or potential subscribers by citing their NewsGuard scores for highly rated publishers of the kind represented on this call. So we appreciate that, and we've tried to create materials to make that super easy for publishers. I think the question may be a little bit broader, which is it's certainly true that there are private companies that are often the targets of disinformation. So for example, one of the hoaxes about COVID is that 5G caused COVID-19. Some of the sites that published that hoax, by the way, a year before COVID-19, had published that 5G causes cancer. And companies like broadband providers, cell phone companies, have had workers attacked by people who think that 5G is dangerous. And some of those do use our BrandGuard product. That's the product that helps advertisers keep their ads off of misinformation sites and steer programmatic advertising toward high quality sites. So we do appreciate that use of our data as well.
Okay, thank you. How about Kim Palmero? You raised a question about the role of journalists.
Yes, I felt like people, readers, the public in general, does not necessarily anymore make a distinction between, how we would view ourselves as journalists and just sort of like everyone else out there writing things. I mean, some people do, but I observe that on Facebook, I think more and more. I hate to keep going back to Facebook. But how do we sort of, engender that trust even on an individual basis, within the roles that we have in our respective organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. My favorite anecdote related to that is, as some of you may know, publishers lobbied Facebook for several years to allow their actual logo to appear in their Facebook account. So that if, the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, it would be their old-fashioned Gothic-looking font, not just, agate-sized Arial font for everybody. And Facebook was reluctant to do it because it signaled that there was something different about brands as opposed to individuals. They eventually relented. But part of our mission actually is to try to restore consumer ability to learn more about a source based on what it is. And we certainly see that brands like news brands are often cited on Facebook and other social media as authorities. That's great when they're green rated sources. It's terrible when what looks like being cited for an authority is itself a source of misinformation and falsehoods. So I think it is certainly a real issue. Consumers are less focused these days on brands than they once were. It's in the nature of how people consume news and information. But I think it's possible that people's awareness of the amount of misinformation that they see in their Facebook feeds or online generally, the data that Matt showed earlier, or the research about how anxious people feel about the quality of the news that they're seeing. I think we may be at a time when consumers will appreciate more trusted brands, and the brands that can remind readers of why they are trustworthy will tend to do better than they have the past few years, when I think consumers lost a bit of focus on what's trustworthy and what's not trustworthy.
Let's turn to, Alex Copland. Alex, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thanks. And thank you for what you guys are doing. It's wonderful. And just recently, the last couple of years, I've been going to, after I read an article, I go check, is it partisan, nonpartisan, biased? And I've been going to all sides a lot because they seem to be fairly, that's the easiest one to get. How do you guys compare to all sides or those media places like yours? How do you guys compare to the other groups?
Yeah, our focus really is on credibility and disclosure and trustworthiness. I think it's a somewhat separate question. Is this site left-wing or right-wing or anarchic or monarchical, whatever position it might have? And there are services that specialize in that. I myself find it a little bit difficult. I'd have a hard time rating the Wall Street Journal, where I spent a long time. The opinion pages are very opinionated, and you could easily ascribe a rightward leaning right, whatever the direction that is, to the opinion pages, but the news pages aspire to be, neutral down the middle. So I think it's a little bit subjective, honestly, and we try to make our work as much as we can objective and fully transparent with minimal subjectivity, though there is admittedly some subjectivity in what we do. But I think it is useful work. I think it's great for people to know, is this coming from a right-wing source or a left-wing source? And we do in our nutrition labels indicate that when we can. So, for example, our nutrition label for National Review quotes William Buckley's founding statement, and our nutrition label for The Nation is very clear about its, other side point of view. And I think that's really important for people to help them learn more about it. It's not the main focus of what we do.
Okay. Is Latrell Crittenton, are you still here, Latrell? Like to hear your question?
Yes.
All right.
So I appreciate this work, and I think that it is very important. However, when you're talking to a lot of consumers about issues related to trust, it's not whether the information is accurate or biased. It is that these sources, particularly local, do not fairly represent or adequately represent our communities on a regular basis. Ergo, I don't trust what's coming out of that because I don't see myself in the actual publication. So I guess and this can be a common or question, my larger question would be, isn't there another way that we need to start thinking about assessing credibility that deals with the fact that when talking to marginalized communities, their idea or concern related to trust isn't what is in the content, but it is what is not being covered or how that framing of coverage often happens, particularly when you're talking about local news coverage?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, honestly, we are not helping very much in terms of our labels in that regard. The one thing that we do is we've gone out of our way to rate websites that are serving particular communities. They might be communities based on race or ethnic group or sexual orientation, even if they're really small sites that wouldn't be in our top 95%. Knowing that a lot of people do count on them, but it's a small subset of people, and that therefore their traffic may not be as great as some other sites. So I think our main contribution is to go out of our way to try to find those sites and rate them so that they're treated the same as the bigger sites for credibility purposes, advertising purposes. But you've identified an issue that's really important for journalism generally, and I think it's a problem a lot of publishers have come to a bit late, and hopefully we'll make some progress. But I would say from our point of view, our way of addressing that issue has been to go out of our way to try to identify those news sites that are covering particular communities of interest. By the way, we were talking earlier about advertising. One thing that we haven't really focused on, but I think it's probably worth mentioning in this context, is that a lot of these websites, these misinformation sites, live for programmatic advertising. They live to be included in computer-generated advertising where blue chip advertisers end up on terrible websites unintentionally. So we've had, the CDC has advertised on Chinese propaganda sites that say that COVID-19 was started in a European lab, crazy thing. And by the same token, historically Black newspapers, ethnic newspapers, gay newspapers, because of the way programmatic advertising is sold, there are what are called keyword block lists that include words like Trump, Biden, COVID, but also Black, Hispanic, gay. And those sites have seen even more pressure on advertising because of those keywords. So one of the uses we're proudest of our Vanguard product is for advertisers that want to restore programmatic advertising to news sites. If they're high-rated sites, they'll turn down the use of those keyword block lists and therefore restore more programmatic advertising to those sites. So thank you for that question.
So we're almost out of time. I want to just round out the discussion with my own question that I posted in the chat. This whole issue of, a lot of the tips that Matt suggested, identifying the ownership, identifying the political bias, identifying who controls the content, we're all predicated on this idea that the consumers care about whether it's objective news or if it's biased. What can we do to help readers care more about legitimate news sites versus, just reading whatever that supports their own point of view?
Well, Matt may have some thoughts. One observation I have is I have seen more news brands focus on that marketing message, on saying, we are reporting the facts, you can trust us. My old place, the Wall Street Journal, has a big ad campaign on the difference between its opinion pages and its news pages. And they recently redid the labeling for news and opinion to make opinion even more clear. In the print days, you knew which pages the opinions were on. It's a lot harder digitally to know that if you're a consumer, so labeling can really help. But I think that for a lot of brands, reminding readers that there's a difference between trustworthy sites and what they're seeing elsewhere is a very big opportunity to restore trust and help with the business model, especially if the business model is subscriptions or memberships or something like that, where part of the message is, something that you can trust is worth more than something that you can't. Matt, you may have other thoughts.
Well, yeah, I would just say there's, as a publisher, you can't really, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. But you at the very least need to lead them to the water. So what I mean by that is, we can't control what readers' preferences may be in terms of content. And if what happens as this whole shift in the media, environment happens, is that at the end of the day, there's no market for quality journalism, then that would be a tragedy. But I don't know that we can change that other than through, education and making sure people from a young age come to kind of appreciate credible sources of information as opposed to not credible ones. But the problem right now is even readers who want credible information don't always know where they can find it. And when readers encounter information and hope that it's credible, they don't always know how to tell whether or not it is. And so I think as a publisher, you can't change the broader, there's not all that much you can do to change the broader shift that's happening in how people consume content. But what you can do is make sure that for the people for whom credibility and trust is a value, something that they value, make sure they know that that's what you're offering and know how and why, and that you're sort of making it super easy for them to trust you if they want to.
Okay. Well, thank you to both Matt and Gordon again. I want to invite Helen Fallon, the president of the Press Club of Western Pennsylvania, to share a few words to conclude and talk about next steps. Helen?
Oh, thanks, Andy. And they will be very brief as we're running very close to 1:30. I want to thank everyone involved with this. Matt, Gordon, thank you for that report. It's a lot to digest, and you've explained it very well. As I tell my students, I'm a professor, you can look at something and read it, but when it's explained to you and we can have this back and forth conversation, it's just so much more valuable, and appreciate it very, very much. I also, on behalf of the partners, which includes Press Club, CMI, the Pennsylvania News Media Association, its foundation, Lenfest, of course, and Thomas Jefferson University, we'd really like this conversation to continue. We have such a road ahead of us, don't we? When you look at this and, we're amazed. I used this for the professors. I used NewsGuard as part of a fake news assignment that I did in class at the beginning and at the end. And it was amazing what the students realized. In fact, it was fun for me to see a student of mine on this call. She must have had to go to class. And that's one way. I really believe in the youth, younger people getting this information, because they don't come to us anymore. I think the professors would agree, with good media literacy skills. Gordon, I fight the good fight for this all the time. And there's many ways. We're going to send you all an email, and for those who didn't make it today, for some suggestions for next steps and where we'd like to go with this. I think there's a lot ahead of us that we can do, and we're really interested in knowing what you all believe as well. So thank you all for attending. Thanks everyone for doing this. Thank you for the report. Just anything you'd like to share with us, we'll be glad to hear it. And we'll keep thinking of different ways to engage us in the future.
I have a very quick follow-through suggestion about what to do next. Obviously, would love to continue to participate in these fora and provide research or support or whatever the topic might be. But Matt Skibinski published a quite forceful and customized op-ed piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer yesterday, and it says don't be fooled by fake news, and there's a nice visual to it, and the example that's given is the Philadelphia specific example. If anyone else wants to run that and adopt it for the local market, I'm sure Matt could provide the information and the customization. And I'm sure the Philadelphia Inquirer wouldn't mind. The same with the Spotlight PA story, which specifically talks about the results of the study, but uses Lehigh Valley as the example. This would be Chris's call, of course, but should Allentown or Erie or York or Pittsburgh wish to customize that story or run a sidebar about the examples from metric media or the left or the right, to make the story localized and to really bring it home, that could be an immediate follow-up as well. The cliche is that all politics is local. It turns out all news is local, and localizing these stories might be the most effective immediate follow-up if people wanted to do it this week.
Thanks very much. That's a great idea, Jim.
Thanks. Thank you, Helen, for everything that you do.
And Helen and Jim, thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you all for your attention and all your great questions. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody.